Hey y'all, this is Kobe R. Rice, and for those of you who don't know me, which you probably wouldn't, I'm pretty small time. I am a sci-fi, fantasy, and survival horror novelist, including dystopia, independently published, and so I had some thoughts based on sort of my own background with writing alternative history and dystopia and whatnot. This is an open letter to D.B. Weiss and David Benioff, alongside, this is not only just to them, but also to their new co-producers, the Spellmans, Mr. Malcolm Spellman and Mrs. Nichelle Spellman. These four individuals have come together to put together a show on HBO called Confederate, which is an alternative history, sci-fi, sort of dystopia-ish story about looking into what if slavery still existed today, and what if the South actually won or maintained their position, as Malcolm Spellman so eloquently put in his interview with, I believe it was Variety or Hollywood Reporter, I forget which one. Anyway, so just like a little bit of background on that for those of you having all these knee-jerk reactions. I certainly already had mine. I made sure to process my knee-jerk reaction and just sort of like get that out with my friends and on my podcast prior to coming in and finally filming this open letter. And then I really sat back and thought about all the different reasons why just the idea of this sort of dystopia bothered me and disturbed me. And so after sort of doing a lot of research, doing a lot of reflection, I am finally back now for to record this open letter. So just sort of as like a brief who's who, Weiss and Benioff are the two executive producers and primary writers for the Game of Thrones, not Throws. Actually, it could be called Game of Thrones, but the Game of Thrones franchise, which is an amazing series, incredible. It's one of my favorite series that are on the air, despite the fact that there's a few things dealing with race, class, and gender that are problematic. Some of them are problematic, some of them just illuminate problems, and that's totally fine. But based off of their raving success with that show, obviously HBO is now giving them another shot at producing the next big hit. And for whatever reason, in, God's unholy hell, these two gentlemen decided that they wanted to basically talk about this alternative history where slavery still exists. Fine. They bring on board two apparently like longtime friends. They've been friends for about a decade. Malcolm Spellman and Nichelle Spellman, who I don't really know much about Nichelle's writing past or her producing past, but I do know that Malcolm is is a writer on Empire and a producer on Empire. And I know that Nichelle also has experience or what have you. So apparently Weiss and Benioff brought these two individuals into this project, and now they're creating it together. So before I start like my analysis, I just want to put out there a major caveat. One, please understand that I will be talking about institutionalized racism and white supremacy, and that refers specifically to institutions, not to individuals, unless you're an individual who supports the institution of white supremacy. Then you have no reason to be offended because I'm talking about you. But if you are a white individual who doesn't support the institution of white supremacy and white privilege, then I'm not talking about you. But please understand that there is a difference between me critiquing the institution of whiteness and me criticizing and labeling and demonizing white people. That's not what I'm doing here. I'm doing the former, not the latter. Okay, that's one. Secondly, I want to talk about the right to write, okay? And I just want to put out there, as a creator myself, it is extremely, extremely difficult to take a concept, make it high concept, develop really interesting, nuanced characters, build an entire plot line, not just for a single story or an episode, but for an entire series. Make sure you're doing some really amazing world building, that you're doing the research, that you're fact checking, that you're getting consultants, that you have editors, for that story. And it's hard to bring all of these elements together into a perfect storm that creates a really amazing, badass story. Trust me, this is what I do all day, every day, and I can't tell you whether or not I do it well, but I can tell you that creating stories and creating good stories is really freaking hard. So I'll usually be the last person to sit down and try to point at creators and writers and tell them what they can and can't do. I don't generally believe in that. I don't believe that for the most part, and I mean in like the grand majority of situations, not all situations. We don't really have the right to tell people what they should be doing with their time as creators, because creating in itself is so difficult and challenging. However, as the audience being on the receiving end of, all of these creations and these brilliant ideas that people put out there, and I put that in quotation marks for a very specific reason, we do have the right to critique those ideas and to challenge them and to interrogate those ideas and to interrogate an artist's intent and to also furthermore interrogate the effectiveness of that artist's approach, their voice, their perspective, and basically we have the right to really question whether or not the end product is doing what it set out to do, and if it is in any way engaging us in a deeper level of reflection and interrogation, or if it's just a bunch of coonery. Like, we do have the right to do that, and when artists and when people in general put their work out there, that is the kind of feedback you should expect. So don't sit there on your high horse, ignoring people and, being upset because people have things to say about your ideas. And this is to all artists. This is just the nature of the game. If you can't take critique and criticism, then shut the fuck up. You don't belong in the world of being an artist, unless you're just a shut-in and you're just making art for yourself and your family. That's whatever. But once you put your stuff out there, even though you have every right to create and express yourself in the way that you want, expect that you're going to get people engaging with your art. So those are the caveats I want to put out there, that I do respect creators, particularly these 4 creators, for coming together and really trying to stir things up and trying to get their voices out there and get their ideas out there. At the same time, strap in and buck up, buttercups, because we know that this is going to be, you're going to get the heat, and you're about to get a little bit from me. Not completely, because this is more sort of a list of inquiries and reflections and questions that I have for you guys, less so than just a flaming criticism, although it's sort of dabbled in there. Okay, so I covered that. So I'm concerned, and the reason why I'm concerned about the Confederate idea is because, first and foremost, I believe in asking the question, why this and why now, right? So why do 2 white men who have money, who have privilege, who have prestige, who have power in the industry, how do these 2 individuals sit down and one day just decide, hey, it would be like a smashing good idea? How about we talk about slavery still existing? That's interesting. I'm sort of wondering how you came to that moment, and actually really read through, and I'm speaking directly to you, DB and David, if you ever watch this. I read through your interviews, and so one of you, and actually let me pull up my notes right now, because I want to state what you guys wrote specifically. Here we go. David Benioff's trigger moment. Okay, you basically said that there was a famous story where General Lee was invading the North, but basically his orders to invade got misplaced and got exposed, and so he wasn't able to invade the North the way that he wanted to. I'm sort of reading right off of and paraphrasing what you said. I have the exact quote here, and I'll put that somewhere either in the comments or a pop-up in the video or whatever. So you basically said, so that notion of what would the world have looked like if Lee had sacked DC, if the South had won, that just always fascinated me. And history as a genre has always been interesting to me. That was really the initial thing. I wish I had a more specific trigger moment for you, but I don't. So basically, you just thought it'd be kind of cool. You like history, whatever. You didn't really think about the deeper, larger implications at first. I'm sure you considered them later. But that's the implication of what you just stated, that you just it just popped into your head. Okay. D.B. Weiss said something a little bit more reflective and at a higher level of intellectual inquiry. He said, it's our original sin as a nation. History does not disappear. In all of our minds, Confederate will be an alternative history show. It's a sci-fi show. And one of the strengths of science fiction is that it can show us this history, show us how this history is still with us in a way no strictly realistic drama ever could, etc., etc. It's an ugly and painful history, and we all think this is a reason to talk about it, not a reason to run from it. And this feels like a potentially valuable way to talk about it. Okay. But you know what's interesting about that is that slavery actually still exists. You don't have to really go back into the past and create an alternative history, because this is what's happening today. If you actually look at the 13th Amendment and read it word for word and actually like take it literally, and I'm going to read this out to you guys because I just pulled this up. Section 1 of the 13th Amendment says specifically, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So, if you didn't catch what that actually means, that basically means that if you have not been convicted of a crime, and that this means any crime, then slavery has been abolished. If you have, however, then for you, dear criminal, slavery very much exists. And if you can't see the correlation between the 13th Amendment and the super high incarceration rates in this country, we have literally the highest rate in the world. We imprison more people than several countries combined, and we disproportionately imprison African American men and men of color. To me, like, you don't need to go back into the past to figure out what our country would look like if slavery still existed. Our black men, our men of color, are still enslaved by being sent to prison. And I'm not saying that some of them have not committed crimes. I'm not saying that, but a lot of them have not. A lot of people are sitting and rotting in prison, working whatever chain gang or working whatever job there is for them, getting paid like, a penny per hour or whatever the rates are. A lot of these guys sitting up in prison are not even guilty of their crimes. A lot of people who are in jail even now haven't even been convicted, but just can't get the bailout to get out of the jail or get out of prison, or are waiting for appeals or whatever. So, not to go too far down that rabbit hole, but if you were looking for inspiration for a new sci-fi dystopia, we are literally living in that dystopia now. Maybe you're not living in it, that's why you didn't know about this, or maybe you did know about this and you just didn't care to pursue that route. But if you were looking for something controversial and interesting to talk about, and you had to use the black body as, your bargaining chip, you could have at least jumped into what we're dealing with now as a nation and as a culture, which is the incarceration rate. So, yeah, minus 10 points on that. But again, I'm going to go back to my first caveat and talk about the right to write, because I'm not going to tell you what ideas you should be writing about or whatever. That's totally up to you. This is why, and as a side note, this is why I write, because when I see crazy shit like this in the media, I can be like, okay, I see this crazy shit going on. Let me write a counterpoint in my novels and in my screenplays and for my films that are going to, fill in the gaps here or address the foolishness here. Anyway, I'm not going to get into independent creation. That's a separate conversation. But I do highly encourage any of you guys who are watching this open letter or who are pissed off about this whole Confederate idea to please get out there and make your stuff, because these people in these institutions who are not affected by, slavery and like Jim Crow and, sundown towns and mass incarceration and redlining and all these things that were derived from this institution, they might care on some superficial sort of Harriet Beecher Stowe level, but they're not really living it the way that we are. So take your experiences and write real dystopias. Anyway, again, this is not passing judgment on something that hasn't been created yet, but that's still something that you should think about. Another question that I sort of have now that we've talked about the origin of your ideas is that I know that you guys are doing like a lot of research and all that. I hope that you're going to put out all the slave facts, like, so, not to be incendiary or whatever, but are we going to talk about how Jews participated in the slave trade? Because if we're not, then like I don't really know like what you're doing here. I mean, if you're gonna tell the truth about slavery, you're gonna tell things, like tell an alternative history, but use real facts. Make sure you use the facts that exposes everybody, including the people that you worked for, including the people who have the power in this industry. And don't come at me talking about how I'm being anti-Semitic or whatever. This is not an anti-Semitic message. This is a anti-bullshit message. This is a message about being honest, about how the owners of this intellectual property, when they're putting these things out there, need to tell the entire truth and own up to their historical contributions to the concepts and ideas that they are courting in their, around their little writers' tables or whatever. So as long as you're willing to tell the whole truth about the slave trade and about, slavery in the South winning or whatever, or the South not winning in real life, but like in alternative history, the South would have won, I'm cool with it. I want to see the realness. I want to see everybody taking responsibility across the board, period. Don't erase that little ugly part of our history out because the people who are, the network executives don't like the fact that, the slave owner's name is Scheinman. I'm just saying. Let's just keep it really real. Anyway, so let's move on. So yeah, and dealing with, the ideas about, I read in your interview as well about how you guys are, there was some sort of interesting concept about how like the country is going to be divided in half, right? You have like half the country maintains their position and continues to own slaves, and the other half of the country doesn't, right? But that doesn't really make any sense because there was like slavery in the North. And yeah, so for a lot of the northern slave states, after the American Revolution, the slavery in those states disappeared rather quickly. But I'm just curious as to what sort of chronological cross-section you guys are going to be dealing with. Are we dealing with the early to mid 1700s, or are we just going to sort of surpass all of that and deal with, deep South antebellum slavery? Like, just, I'm just curious. These are just things that like I'm throwing out there. If I were an executive producer in this crazy idea, these are all the things I'd be talking about. I'd be talking about who really owned slaves, not just, the quote unquote Southern white hicks. It wasn't all about that. Yes, they did. Not all of them, a very small percentage of them, but that was a big thing down there. But the North, people in the North also owned slaves. Jews owned slaves. Okay, let's just keep it real. So if we're going to talk about hashtag slave facts, like let's get all the facts correct, basically. But, of course, because this is a science fiction and dystopia, there's going to be some, creative liberties taken here. So we'll see, what kinds of truths come out in this alternative history and what kind of truths are sort of, kept under the rug. All right, so that's the next thing. Again, there's just questions, just, reflections that I have. Point number 3. So this is something that I realized that the Spellmans are very sensitive about. And after reading their interview, I really reflected on how I was going to approach this part of my open letter. So just as sort of a preamble, I respect you guys. I really do. I'm not out here to call you coons or house Negroes, or anything like that, or tap dancing, or, shucking and jiving. I'm not here to like throw all those labels on you at all. I do want to treat you as human beings. At the same time, I have some questions about your willingness to participate in this. And I see both sides of it, I understand that when Benioff and Weiss called you and they were like, yo, we need your perspective on this. This is, it wouldn't make sense for us to not have voices of color, faces of color in this. That's all well and good. But why didn't they call you guys when it was time to hand out episodes for Game of Thrones? That episode, Misa, where you had all the black and brown people holding up Daenerys Targaryen like she was the white savior. Where were y'all at? And I'm not even blaming you. I'm just saying, why weren't they calling you being like, yo, Nichelle, can you help us understand like what we're doing wrong in this episode? Or can you help us, make this look a little bit less, I don't know, imperialist? This is what I'm saying. It's like I have friends and artists here that sometimes I collaborate with. Sometimes we do our own thing. But they don't call me only when it's time to write some slave shit. They call me because they respect me as a writer, as an artist in general, and if they feel that I can contribute something, of use and of substance to their projects, whether or not it's about black people, and I would never get called by some of my closest friends just on the slavery projects. Now, again, please understand, I'm not trying to assume anything about your relationship with Benioff and Weiss. I really am not. But I have a really close friend. I'm not going to name her, but she's one of my best friends and one of, somebody that I do try to collaborate with as often as possible. If this chick called me only when it was time to talk about some slave shit, we would be fighting for real. Okay, if she's watching this, she knows who she is, and she knows that she would never do that. Okay, she knows that there are certain things that I can give insight on. There are certain things that she can give insight on my projects, where we're constantly giving each other feedback, not only because, the stuff is culturally relevant. So I would be really suspect about that. And I don't think that Black Twitter is necessarily completely off base with, they might have come at you, out of left field and kind of crazy, and I don't believe in disrespecting anybody, especially if you don't know them. But think about it, though. If they, why, and I'm sorry, again, back to Benioff and Weiss, if you care so much about black voices and diversity, both in front of and behind the camera, why is pretty much all of your crew white men with a minority of white women? You know what I'm saying? You had Vanessa Taylor, you had Jane Espenson, as the two writers / occasional producers. That was great. The cinematographer that got the most episodes filmed and who did an amazing job was a white woman. Okay, that's nice. But most of your directors were white guys with beards. Most of your cinematographers and your editors are white people. Why don't you give a shit about black voices and black presence on Game of Thrones? Why is it only when it's time to give us a dose of white privilege and white supremacy? Why is it that that's when you call the black people in? As though okay, we have this bottle examining, sort of maybe examining and shoving white supremacy down people's throats. But in order for them to really be able to take it, we have to give them a chaser with blackface on it. I feel like that's really disrespectful and messed up. I would be looking at you sideways. If we were friends and you only called me on the slave show, I'd be like, no, goodbye, peace. That's just me, though. For me, my integrity is more important than other things. And again, this is just a concept. We're only in the idea phase right now, world. So I'm not trying to assume too much, but just the circumstances under which you recruited the Spellmans, to me, is suspect and it's fucked up. If you really cared about having their input, you should have asked for it on Game of Thrones. You should have asked for it from other people. You look really fucked up right now. I'm sorry. This is probably why this is not going to go, get to many people, because I have curse words in it. But I don't really care. I'm just being real. Yeah. And obviously, we don't need to really state about the way in which you treated women and people of color on Game of Thrones, which could have used a woman's hand in more of those episodes, and certainly, the hands of people of color, just telling you where you were looking all types of crazy. You could have had us in there. You could have had us in that room, but you didn't. But now when it's time to write some slave shit, of course, in order to get us to swallow it and accept it, you dress it up in proverbial blackface, which I find insulting. And I don't mean to insult the Spellmans, but this is how it's looking to us. I'm sorry, this is just how it looks. They deserve better than that. You guys, the Spellmans, deserve better than that. You deserve to get called on any projects that they have going on. You deserve, if there's a fantasy project going on where basically there are no rules except for the rules that you make. There are no race rules. I mean, it depends on what franchise you're using, right? With, Game of Thrones, like, you can't necessarily turn all the male characters to women without it, like, sort of challenging the premises of, like, his original story, right? And sort of throwing things off, whatever. That'd be interesting. I would love to see that. But, the original premises you have to keep in place for certain fantasy franchises. But now that Benioff and Weiss have pretty much carte blanche to do whatever they want, like, why not just create another fantasy? You're obviously good at fantasy. I'm not saying you have to pigeonhole yourself, but why not create a fantasy sort of in the vein of Game of Thrones with a different storyline, different characters, but more inclusive of different voices of color? Unique, creative, like something that's really gonna get attention and really actually move the needle on conversations in this country. Like, because people, I mean, not to say that we shouldn't talk about slavery, but ultimately, I mean, white people don't want to talk about slavery anymore. Like, let's just keep it real. Y'all don't want to talk about it anymore. And, like, I feel like we've gotten to the point where, we are still hashing out over and over sort of like the same political talking points and not really connecting with each other, not really growing with each other. I feel like and I'm not saying we should never talk about reality, but if we're going to take a departure from reality, like, why not take the fantastical route that's completely unique, where people are completely severed and separated from that world such that they feel comfortable talking about those things. Again, not trying to tell you how to do stuff, but I'm just going off of the words that you said in your interview when you were trying to rationalize and justify why you were writing about this idea. Which again makes this so suspect to me, because if you really want to talk about slavery and have a real conversation about the things that are affecting us, you had the material right in front of you by looking at the incarceration system. You have the material by looking at redlining. You have the material by looking at the actual wealth gap. Okay, I think I'd be interested in seeing, for example, a harried lobbyist trying to get the Third Amendment basically amended again to take out that clause about how criminals should be subject to slavery. I think that'd be interesting. I think if somebody actually tried to do that in real life and tried to get that amendment changed where you couldn't enslave criminals, somebody would be trying to assassinate his ass, because the prison system makes way too much money off of the 13th Amendment. And so I just think that that's interesting. But that's just me. This is clearly betraying, like, my concerns. So, that's another thing. If you guys have your own concerns, like I was saying, about society and about the things that are happening, definitely go and make your shit, because I will be making mine. But, again, I'm just questioning the genuineness of, their reasons for this concept. I guess another reason why I had a knee-jerk reaction is because I feel as though whenever mass culture, and I mean white culture, is hitting a lukewarm period, like where things are not really happening, black people are the grenade that is thrown into the mix of white culture to shake things up. Like, we are not your fucking hot potato, okay? We really aren't. And, there are a lot of things that you could look at, and if you're really just history nerds, there were a whole host of things that you could look at that would have been interesting, that would have been successful. AMC, and I know you guys are not AMC, but AMC did a very interesting series called Hell on Wheels, like, highlighting an interesting part of American history that was pretty much could be approached from a variety of angles, and so it didn't have to deal specifically with the hot button topic of blacks versus white, of slaves versus not slaves. Like, I just feel as though, whenever people are fucking bored, they use black people as their entertainment. And I'm just kind of tired of it. Like, aren't you guys tired of it, Mr. and Mrs. Spellman? Like, wouldn't you prefer to write some afro-futuristic shit? Or you know, maybe something like the Black Hunger Games. And I hate saying the black whatever because we're not derivatives of white culture. We really are not. But wouldn't you prefer to like do something in like the Black Panther sort of, you know, vein, or something that's just completely unique that sees us actualized as full human beings that are not slaves, who are in charge of our own destinies, who can explore different, you know, parts of the universe and the world on our own? Like, why can't we come together and make something like Star Wars, not like Star Wars, but like a space opera-esque thing, but with people of color in it, with, you know, black leads or whatever? You know, why can't we do that? Why do we always have to hop onto the fucking slave train because, oh, it's HBO and that's gonna forward my career? Like, I mean, can we have some fucking integrity? You know, is basically like my question. Again, I'm not going to go too crazy on it because I don't want to disrespect the Spellmans and I don't want to assume anything. But, I mean, with the massive, massive, insane success of Luke Cage on Netflix, you know, and, you know, honestly, comparatively, I liked Luke Cage. But, you know, I think there were certain things that could have been tightened up in the writing. The action could have been a little bit more punched up. There were certain things that I just, you know, didn't latch on to. I enjoyed it as a whole. But, you know, there were some things that could be improved. Yet and still, Luke Cage quite literally broke the internet, okay? Where people could not sign on to Netflix. The servers are crashing. Like, that massive success. You know, if you're a woman watching this, the massive success of Wonder Woman. For all of us who are going to go and show the fuck out for Black Panther, I mean, that trailer that just dropped, that's getting shared like crazy, that has us just salivating and just waiting for that. I mean, with people latching on, particularly African Americans, because our spending power is ridiculous, okay? We don't need to go to the slave shit in order to make us as a people relevant. We don't need to continue to tell those stories over and over and over again because those are the only stories wherein the white institutions can see us as a viable part of society. Like, we don't need to do that. And with all the advent of like this new sci-fi stuff, with, you know, the success of, you know, these superhero movies, the ones with people of color, Luke Cage, Black Panther, whatever, all those things, there's no reason why we should have to keep going back to that old narrative. There's no reason. We can start envisioning ourselves in a superhero context, in a political thriller context, in an afro-futuristic context. I'm going to show out for Proud Mary because I don't know what you guys feel about it, but you see a badass black chick who's basically, I don't know if she's an assassin or if it's a revenge thriller, but like it has two black leads and we're not slaves and we're out there kicking ass and you know, basically like being like born supremacy, but like black supremacy. Oh gosh, I just laughed even saying that. I had to say that. I'm sorry. Come on. You know, like that's something I want to show up for. Seeing us in different contexts, seeing us realized in different spaces. Like, so I don't know. I think of all the things you could have chosen to do for HBO next, that was a poor fucking choice. Sorry. I mean, like, and honestly, if you really want to talk about alternative history, here's an idea for you. How about you write an alternative history where the white people are slaves? That's something that's interesting to me. But don't make the slave owners black because I don't want people who are black to be demonized any more than we already are. But I think that'd be really fucking interesting. You want to start a conversation about the dehumanization and the animalization of black people in this country? You want to start a conversation about what our country would look like if certain events hadn't occurred? Start with that. Because that... See, you get a whole bunch of white people in a room watching that shit, you might start getting people to finally understand what Black Lives Matters is all about. You see black cops, or let's call them green cops. Okay, we're gonna make them alien cops because I don't want to see our people in that position oppressing people. You see cops hosing down white people, lynching white people, you know, setting dogs on white people, bombing their churches, murdering them, enslaving them, raping them. I mean, I don't want to see that on screen because that's like gratuitous and terrible. But if you really want to start a conversation about how black people have been treated in this country historically, just literally take our entire history and switch the positions. Talk about that. But don't like write some dystopia about like, well, what if the blacks were never enslaved? And this is one thing that I will hold you to, Mr. and Mrs. Spellman, particularly you, Mr. Malcolm Spellman. Okay, you wrote here, well, I think the interviewer like was he made the mistake, or she made the mistake of saying like, oh, how do you feel about an alternative history where the South has won? And you stated, Mr. Spellman, this. Let me read it right here because I just literally copied and pasted it. Oh gosh, I'm sorry. This is not Malcolm Spellman. This is Nichelle Spellman, I believe. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I could be wrong, or I'll correct myself. I think that using the word winning creates the wrong image. In the world of Confederate, it was a standstill. They maintain their position. The North maintains theirs. What kind of myopic, ahistorical bullshit is that, Mrs. Spellman? No offense, but you do realize that slavery itself, even though it was supposedly couched in the South, that it extended to areas in the North, that people were literally getting snatched off the fucking streets and dragged back down and lied on and said that they were escaped slaves when they actually weren't? You realize that that Jim Crow and all those things, you know, I forget what the law is called. Was it the tattletale law? I'm going to call it the snitch law. You know, that those things were still very real. Like, slavery was not just cordoned off at like in a certain part of our country. Like, slavery is not just a physical state. It is a cultural disease. It is a mental and intellectual and spiritual disease that has infected our country for hundreds of years. I know that you realize this. I'm not talking down to you, but I feel like that statement, I'm not trying to blow it out of context too much, but I feel like that statement was ridiculous, as though slavery itself was just like, oh, well, that's just them over there. It doesn't actually mean that the rest of the white population doesn't actually feel, superior to us or anything. What the fuck? Like, it's just crazy to me. It's really insane to me. Like, just the mental acrobatics that we're doing to sort of justify like why this is a good idea. Anyway, this letter sort of got off track. I don't care. But so that's really all I have to say. I don't want to treat, and this is to the Spellmans particularly, I don't want to act as though you guys are props and you don't have agency over your own life or whatever. But I do hope once you start raking in all the money that you're going to get from this series, that you then go and make your own shit. And I'm not even, like, this is not even just directed towards them. This is directed towards all the people all the black people in Hollywood who are just fucking shucking and jiving or just going with the flow because you're afraid you're not going to get hired on the next project or whatever. Go get your money. Do your thing, get your money, and then you need to go and make your own shit. You have the connections, you have the money, make investments, pool your resources, go put together something dealing with, sci-fi, fantasy, dystopia, real life, whatever. Something that truly reflects the state and the diversity and the power of the black community. And that doesn't mean that we all have to be angels, but we do have to, I feel like, be diversely represented in our personalities and where we come from. And make your own shit. Like, there's no way I would ever, I don't know, just in my circle of creators, like, this just would never be a thing. And I don't know why this is a thing for you guys in Hollywood. Anyway, that's all I have to say, This is not, I'm not trying to shame anybody, but I do have to get out there my feelings about it, why I feel as though, you're having this knee-jerk reaction from everyone, and what you need to own up to. And I don't care if it's just an idea. Like, some ideas are just bad fucking ideas. We throw out ideas as writers all the time. Ideas come and go. Ideas can be, ideas are just ideas. So, if this doesn't get off the ground, I'm sorry, but I'm sure you'll find something else that's going to be just as great. And if this doesn't get off the ground, Mr. Weiss and Benioff, I hope that you would pitch something that is just as compelling, but more inclusive. And I hope that you would call the Spellmans on that project, because if you don't, you're going to look really fucked up. And that's all I have to say. Good luck. I'll be waiting. And I will definitely check out the first episode if this goes through and, it gets filmed and aired or whatever. I will most certainly check out the first episode because I don't want to trash it before I have seen it. But basically, I'm just sort of waiting for black people in media to wake the fuck up and stop being beholden to all these ideas that are coming from people who don't share our experience and have no idea what it means to be a black person or a slave or anything like that. So that's all I have to say. Good luck, and hopefully, maybe with some luck, Weiss and Benioff will get you guys to maybe direct or produce or write an episode of Game of Thrones, because, I know that you have more talent that extends beyond empire, coonery, and slavery. I believe that you do. Although I have to say, Empire is certainly entertaining. I haven't watched it recently, though. So that's all I have to say is make sure that you're appreciated, and not just for the narratives that reaffirm white supremacy and white institutional oppression, and don't only be appreciated for reaffirming those narratives and those images of us in the media. I hope that when you start doing your own stuff, you'll get the same support from the same people who are basically recruiting your support for their causes and for their projects. I sincerely hope that happens. Anyway, I'm signing off. I don't know if this became an open letter or an open rant, but if I have anything else to say, I'll just come back on and say it. Peace out and good luck, and I guess I'll see y'all in 2019 when Confederate airs. Most certainly with my tea and my popcorn and my pen and paper in hand. Peace. Bye-bye.